Not since the rise of Rome 800 years before had the Italian peninsula been split between rival states. Even in the 20-year-long war between the Eastern Empire and the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy, there was no question of accepting more than one state within Italy. The war was for the whole of Italy, not for part of it. But when King Alboin led the Lombard people into Italy, over the Julian Alps in the spring of 568, this would make Italy a divided land for the next 13 centuries. King Alboin had taken Friuli without much of a fight, and with northern Italy weakened from 2 decades of war, he moved west. The Lombard kingdom being built by King Alboin was set up as a series of duchies, with the central cities of the Po Valley to the west ruled by dukes who founded dynasties of their own, which King Alboin set up one by one. Treviso was next, then Vicenza, Verona. The city of Milan was abandoned before his army, and he took it without a fight. But Pavia, the former capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom, held out against him for 3 years. Legend says that upon entering the city, his horse collapsed under him and would not move until he spared the lives of the people in the city, when it miraculously rose to its feet again. The people of Pavia saw this as a sign to support the Lombards. Convenient. The energetic king was set to make further conquests, but his wife Rosamund wanted revenge. As I noted in the last part of this series, Queen Rosamund was a Gepid princess. King Alboin had destroyed her people's kingdom, killed her father and brothers, forced her to marry him, and then made her drink wine from a cup carved out of the skull of her own father. She waited years for the right moment to kill him, and recruiting one of the king's own advisors, Helmichis, and a warrior named Perideo, they plotted to kill the king at a feast in Verona in 572, and to seize the throne in a coup d'etat. The assassination succeeded, but the coup d'etat failed when the Lombard nobles refused to accept Helmichis as king. Queen Rosamund fled to Ravenna, which would be a thorn in the side of the Lombards for the next 2 centuries. It was a naval fortress held by the Byzantine Empire on the Adriatic coast. Rosamund was cunning and plotted with the chief officer of Ravenna, Longinus, to kill Helmichis with poison and then to rule Ravenna with him. But this failed and she died alongside Helmichis, both taking the poison. Back in Pavia, the dukes gathered to choose a new king. They chose a violent aristocrat named Clef, who they let loose upon their borders to the south to solidify the kingdom. He conquered Tuscia, or Tuscany, and pushed toward Ravenna but was unable to capture it. King Clef put down the Romans and Byzantines who held out against him in the north. He also kept King Alboin's policies and laws, which stabilized the land, except he did do one thing a bit mad. He went around killing random Latin aristocrats to break the old Ostrogoth and Byzantine legal institutions and steal their gold, because an unhappy slave assassinated him. He had only ruled for 2 years, but his legacy is what is called Longobardia Major, the Lombard lands held in the north of Italy. This would differentiate it later on from Longobardia Minor, Lombard lands held in the south of Italy, which adventurous dukes had already begun conquering in 571. And if you want to understand how Italy broke up into city-states and principalities for centuries, the root of it is this. Because the north was a series of duchies, and upon the death of King Clef, the Lombard dukes did something unexpected. In the year 574, they decided not to have a king. Paul the Deacon wrote in his Historia Longobardum that lands of the Lombards were split by the rule of 35 dukedoms, who were each ruled by military families who chose a patriarch. Anyone who is familiar with the early Italian Renaissance can tell you this is starting to look a bit like the Italy later ages would know. But I did mention southern Italy, and I need to go back to that briefly. In 570, a group of Lombards invaded the south. A duke named Ferwald set up a duchy around Spoleto, and then a Lombard duke named Zotto, I like that name, took a chance and led an army further south in Campania to fight the Byzantines, who he beat over and over again. Since he pushed the Byzantines out from above Naples, and the lands of the papacy around Rome were a buffer between him and royal Lombard authority, Zotto decided to set up his own little kingdom called the Duchy of Benevento in 571. So now there were two semi-independent Lombard quasi-kingdom duchies in the south, a confederation of Lombard duchies in the north with a capital at Pavia, with the Eastern Empire holding Naples, Ravenna, and Sicily, and with what would become the Papal States slowly forming a defensive position around Rome by using the Pope whilst Franks threatened to invade from the north. Italy was already a mess, and it was about to get worse. This age of dukes without a king was the final end of the old Roman aristocracy, because the only way these dukes could keep power was by letting their men raid the old Roman estates for wealth, which obviously led to two big problems for the Lombards. One, if your economy is based on raiding the wealth of your previous aristocracy, you will run out, which causes you to invade the lands of neighboring Lombard dukes, which destabilizes your kingdom. Two, if you want to keep peace between Lombards, you have to join together to raid the lands of neighboring kingdoms at a time when you are weak and a divided kingdom, without a king, which will lead to wars that you lose. The Lombard elites still had the mindset of a migrating warrior people, which does not work in a Western Europe of emerging, at least semi-stationary, kingdoms. In the late 570s, 3 Lombard dukes joined together and raided the Burgundian kingdom of Guntram, looking for booty, and then crossed into the Frankish kingdom, raiding and pillaging as they went. I cannot believe how stupid this is. 3 Lombard duchies basically gave all of what is now France, Belgium, and Western Germany a reason for war. On top of this, the Byzantines pushed out from Ravenna, hoping to take more Italian land. The Franks and Burgundians invaded through the Alps, and so the Lombard dukes were in flight and crapping their trousers about what to do. In a panic, they chose a new king, Authari, son of Clef, and granted him rights over the city of Pavia as their capital, and promised their neighbors they would be civilized and adopt a central form of government if they did not invade and kill them. The Franks liked this idea. They wanted stability, that's all. So after Authari agreed to give the Franks an annual tribute, they went back home across the Alps. This annoyed the Byzantines because they had to accept peace to not upset the Franks. Those two, the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Franks, had a kind of rivalry thing going on, but they also did not want to upset one another since they were both far enough away from each other to kind of be good for each other. The Lombards, however, were between these two, so the new king Authari set out to unify his lands at once, killing dissident nobles, as well as adopting a more Roman attitude in culture and Christianity, but he had a thorn in his southeastern side. King Authari's main enemy was Duke Droktov, whose backstory is complicated, but bear with me a few seconds. Droktov had left his own people, another Germanic barbarian group called the Alemanni, to join the Lombards in his childhood, and came into Italy with them in 568. But he turned on his adopted people and joined the Byzantines in Longobardum Minor, the southern part of the Lombard-held lands. He flipped sides more than once, and then the Byzantines made him general, and then duke over Biscelo. Being between Lombard and Byzantine control, Droktov changed sides for about the 15th time, and decided to try and create a small, independent kingdom of his own, using his duchy. The only problem is he was surrounded by the Lombard kingdom, and no sensible king in King Alfred's shoes would let this happen. This story is so Italian. A single small duchy, built around one small city, decided to just go do its own thing despite being inside another kingdom. In the middle of the road, its king needed to link up with Tuscany, and then Drogoth almost actually won. He pushed southeast into Spoleto to counter the Lombard threat to his north and gather resources. In the end, however, King Aetheri got rid of this guy, and Drogoth fled to Ravenna to hide with the Byzantines, where he changed sides again. King Aetheri married a woman named Theolinda, the daughter of a Bavarian duke. This was a wise marriage politically. Theolinda was part of a great Bavarian dynasty, which would come to shape much of Lombard history. Bavaria was held by a family under the Merovingians' rule to the north. I like that word Merovingian, but it's difficult to say. Anyway, they were hostile to his own enemy, the Franks, this Bavarian family. And Theolinda, she was also a Catholic Christian, despite himself, King Aetheri, being an Arian Christian, which eased tensions between the Lombard kingdom and the papal lands around Rome and along his southern border. The Pope sent her expensive gifts for bringing the Lombards closer to Catholicism. Unfortunately, her husband was poisoned 2 years later and he died. It always strikes me how common poisoning was in the age. The dukes allowed her to select a new husband who would be king. That was nice of them. She chose Agilulf, who was raised on the shields of his men as king of Milan in 591. He may or may not have been a full Catholic, or just a Catholic in name to win over political enemies, but their son, Adalowald, was certainly a Catholic. And by their son's time, the Lombards were leaving Arian Christianity and shifting more fully into the Catholic world. His father Agilulf had a mostly peaceful reign, quite rare, and a long one, 26 years. He died in 616. King Adalowald seems to have let his mother, Theolinda, run the kingdom for him, though he did move the capital from Pavia to Milan, probably because he did not like the dukes. Meanwhile, Theolinda had churches built during her lifetime, which strengthened the well-being, unity, and finances of the kingdom. Remember, church was serious business. People gave donations, which went up to the clergy and into the administration. There was a lot of money in a church. The magnificent Iron Crown of Lombardy is from her reign, and was used as a religious and political symbol to wield power. The famous Irishman Columba also built a friendship with her, but as for Theolinda, she was likely an overbearing mother who caused her son to have mental issues. King Adalowald slowly went insane, and Theolinda took over in all but name, bringing Pope Gregory directly into the affairs of the Lombard kingdom and allowing missionaries from Rome to spread in Lombard lands. The dukes, with their privileges and lands, did not like papal interference, and they threw their backing behind a young rebel named Arianiswald, the Duke of Turin, who married Theolinda's daughter, Gundeberga. Now imagine this, if you are Queen Theolinda. Your king and son, Adalowald, with whom you are co-ruler, is slowly losing his mind from mental illness, whilst your daughter's husband, Arianiswald, rises up to claim the crown for himself. What would you do? Which of your children would you side with? It looks like Queen Theolinda realized all her choices were bad. She stepped back and let the dukes vote on the kingship and did not try to get in the way. They elected Arianiswald as king in 626, who promptly had his wife and Theolinda's daughter, Gundeberga, locked up in a monastery. However, that may be a story made up by Catholics to smear him, because he re-established Arian Christianity in the Lombard elite, and the Pope hated this guy. What we do know is that he returned the capital to Pavia, and defeated the Avars along his eastern border in Friuli. He dies of natural age or natural causes in 636, which is remarkable. I mean, in that age, if you stage a coup d'etat to become king, and do not wind up killed by someone else, you did good. Something that Western progressives today simply do not understand is that when a social movement pushes too far, the culture swings the other way on social issues, in a cultural backlash. Queen Theolinda's Catholicism caused a rebirth of Lombard Arianism, as well as Germanic culture and laws, against both the Pope and the Franks. The dukes chose the Duke of Brescia, Rothari, to be king in 636, who proved to be one of the great Lombard kings. His greatness lay not in being idealistic, he was a realist. His reign lasted 16 years, and it's noteworthy how stable this period was, compared to what would follow. King Rothari was forced from the start to reckon with a divide between Arians and Catholics, between Lombards and Romans, so he freed Gundeberga from her captivity in the monastery and married her, despite him being Arian and her being Catholic. This act healed his people and brought peace between the two sides. It also must be noted somewhere in this video that the Jewish people thrived in Italy at this time precisely because the Lombard legal system was moderate. Pope Gregory I had passed Sicut Judaeus, a letter protecting the Jews, around 598, for events further south where Jews were targeted. But in Lombard lands this was not really needed. On top of this, King Rothari being able to bridge Arianism and Catholicism gave an opening for Judaism and Jewish life within his kingdom. Apart from Jews being banned from the Wargangi, a legal class of warriors, Rothari was very open to people of every religion in his kingdom. Remember that Islam did not exist yet. King Rothari was likely quite secular and non-religious himself, which let him be tolerant of both sides in the Arian-Catholic divide. To prevent coups d'etats from his dukes, he was ruthless to any who opposed him, and generous to those who sided with him. He was a military commander, and took the Ligurian coast around Genoa for the Lombard kingdom. The Frankish Chronicle of Fredegar records King Rothari's conquest of Liguria. He also took lands in the Venetian plain to the east, which was held by the Exarchate of Ravenna, a constant thorn in the side of the Lombard kingdom. For all his successes, he did not manage to take Ravenna itself, despite killing 8,000 soldiers of the Exarchate. The Lombards were beginning to see the reality of the situation. The Pope was slowly creating a political state, which would split their future kingdom in two. But you don't just kill the Pope, do you? This was a problem. So King Rothari focused on the building of his own state. He codified the laws of his kingdom in the Edict of Rothari. The image we see in the laws is that of a decentralized state, in which the king has little power, outside military command, and rights to change the legal structure of social privileges and punishments. The edict notes the needs of the poor as well as the rich, and shows us a vast gulf still existed between the rights of Lombards and the rights of Romans, who were often merely a slave class. Jews are not really mentioned, which is different from the Byzantines and Visigoths, who passed laws against Jews. The focus of Lombard law, however, was spent on stopping the blood feuds between rival families and dukes, to bring order to the realm without taking away privileges which might cause revolt or rebellion. Witnesses were called oath helpers, and most of the legal code is a working effort to shift Lombard society from one of transactions in blood to one of transactions in money. These laws modernized the Lombard state and brought a sense of unity among Lombard dukes, in that they could expect peace between each other whilst ruling over half-free non-elite Lombards, and the unfree Romans and descendants of war captives, who they saw as property. But also Roman law was respected as well. Lombard law and Roman law and Jewish law coexisted within the same cities, and part of Rothari's work was including Roman ideas. King Rothari allowed men to have more than one wife, but did not allow women to have more than one husband. King Rothari died in 652. Rothari's son Rodoald gained the kingship after him, and King Rodoald was an Arian, not a Catholic. He also enjoyed sleeping around with other men's wives. That's a bit unstable, isn't it? The next year, in 638, one of the husbands of one of the women he slept with killed him. Ironically, this was the kind of thing Rothari's laws were trying to stop. Queen Theolinda's nephew, Aripert, of the same Bavarian dynasty, was put in charge as king in 653. He was a Chalcedonian Christian, which renounced Arian ideas but holds that the Christian Messiah, Jesus, has two unmixed natures, divine and human. This does not go nearly as far from Catholicism as Arianism. It's kind of a compromise, and I must stress that in every age of human history, except for the last 50 years and only in rich, first world Western liberal countries, religion is not a decoration, and no society can ignore the spiritual part of our human nature without collapsing. Religion is essential to understanding any culture whatsoever, including the Lombards. King Aripert promptly built a church outside Pavia. His reign was stable and peaceful, which helped Catholicism gain ground. When he died 8 years later, the lands were in a good state, but he made one foolish move as he lay dying. He convinced the nobles to elect 2 kings after him, Perctarit and Godepert, one being Arian and the other being Catholic. It's understandable, and I can see why he did this. He was trying to create a bridge, a balance between these rival factions, but it wasn't going to end well. It does not take a genius to guess that war was coming. Maybe King Aripert had tried to build a lasting peace, and if so, it was a noble attempt on his part, but it was doomed to fail. The Catholic King Perctarit ruled from Milan, whilst the Arian King Godepert ruled from Pavia. War broke out between their supporters, not between them, and each of them, to keep hold of popular mood and power, had to support those who were backing them, which meant a Lombard civil war between Arian and Catholic kings. The Catholic Perctarit sought an ally further to the south named Grimoald, the Duke of Benevento, and it just spiraled into madness. Godepert had sent the Duke of Turin, Garibaldi, to convince Grimoald to join him against Perctarit, but Garibaldi and Grimoald decided to join forces against both Godepert and Perctarit. Yeah, I get this is confusing, but bear with me. Whilst King Godepert was still alive, who did not last long, this meant a 3-way war, an Arian king in the north, a Catholic king in the north, and now the Duke of Turin aligned with the Duke of Benevento in the south. The dukes took out Godepert in Pavia, and Perctarit fled over the Alps and into the lands of the Avars. Then Garibaldi was murdered by one of Godepert's men. This meant that after around 6 months of insane chaos, the Duke of Benevento, now King Grimoald, was the only man left standing in the room. Strangely, and there must be good reason for this, King Grimoald captured King Perctarit's wife and his son Kunigpert, and then allowed them to rule Longobardo Minor in the south over Benevento and Spoleto. He must have seen them as some kind of insurance policy, but why give them power? Perctarit was still conspiring to remove King Grimoald. Meanwhile, King Grimoald had to rule a kingdom. He was an Arian, not a Catholic, which gave the Eastern Roman Empire, Franks, and the Avars justification for attacking him. He defeated the Byzantines under Emperor Constantine at Benevento, and pushed them back to Sicily, securing his southern border. He crushed a rebel duke Lupus in Friuli in the northwest by letting Avars, who were in conspiracy with Perctarit, come in over the mountains. He wanted the Avars to hand over the former king, but they refused. King Grimoald used the rebellion of Lupus in the northeast. The Avar army and the army of Lupus collided with each other. By exhausting both of his enemies, pitting them against each other, King Grimoald then moved in and cleaned up the mess. Perctorit saw his hand was played, and he had failed in his plot to use the Avars to remove Grimoald from power. So he came back to Italy and begged Grimoald for mercy. Paul the Deacon writes that King Grimoald spared his life. However, this was a ploy to avoid public scandal, and he planned to poison Perctorit. Why are these people always using poison? He planned to poison Perctorit, who then heard about his plan and fled to Pavia by being lowered over the wall. Perctorit fled over the Alps to the kingdom of the Franks, where he convinced King Clothar III to attack the Lombards. King Grimoald defeated the Frankish invasion, however, under Clothar III by feigning a retreat, leaving alcohol in his camp and waiting for the Franks to get drunk before coming back and killing them. Clearly, this man had skills. After his victory, he sought a peace treaty with the Franks, who accepted. This was done to check Perctorit, who, seeing his second attempt at getting rid of Grimoald was a failure, he was on his way to Britain to find another army when King Grimoald suddenly died. Perctorit rushed back toward Italy with a small army that grew as he marched south. Grimoald had left his child son Garibald on the throne, who was also an Arian. The crowds cheered Perctorit as he returned to Italy, and they took the child from the kingship and cast him out from the kingdom. Perctorit's life was epic. As for young Garibald, I imagine he was either assassinated or lived out his life in a monastery. We don't know. It doesn't usually end well for child kings who are deposed. Perctorit brought his wife and son back up from the south and made Catholicism the official religion. Despite this, he did not bow to papal authority. He clearly saw that Roman lands split his lands in half, and this was a problem. Paul the Deacon is very praiseworthy of King Perctorit, but then again, Perctorit was a Catholic, and the one who saw off the last Arian king, so of course he would like him. Also, King Perctorit was not nice to Jews. He gave many Jews two options: baptism or banishment. Consequently, the Jewish communities further south grew, being outside his rule, which suggests a religious intolerance that enabled him to solidify power by getting rid of the Arian faction within the nobility. King Perctorit ruled for another 18 years. That's quite a feat. Another feat is he passed on the crown to his own flesh and blood son, Cunigpert, in 688. Cunigpert's reign is important because what we have here is the final finale of Arian resistance to Catholic rule. Shortly after taking power, the Duke of both Trent and Brescia, Alagis, who was an Arian, revolted and took the throne, forcing Cunigpert into a castle on an island in Lake Como. Well, if you are exiled to an island with what followers you have left, this is a beautiful place to be. But it was a mistake, because Cunigpert escaped a year later. He found allies in the Catholic clergy of Piedmont, who gave him troops to fight against Alagis. I hesitate from saying King Alagis, because the Catholic institutions never officially recognized Alagis as king. In fact, they were probably the ones who freed Cunigpert in the first place. So much of kingship is holding the respect of institutions to use them against your enemies, and Cunigpert succeeded in this. With the clergy backing him, he built an army and defeated Alagis in the Battle of Coronate, near present-day Lodi in Lombardy, the region the Lombards gave their name to. He won his kingdom back, and to be fair, his first test was likely his most difficult, but he had many revolts of dukes and other noblemen against him across his reign. The old Arian aristocracy were not happy that a king was using the Catholic Church to solidify power. One notable revolt took place in the northeast, when a man named Ansfrid overran Friuli and then made a bid to take over Verona, which would then enable him to strike at the capital. King Kunigpert defeated him in battle, and then blinded him before sending him into exile. This blinding tactic was common in the time, but it was common more to the Byzantines, as a way of removing political threats without murder. The Lombards are adopting methods of different rulers across Europe now, and if you think about it, blinding is an improvement on the social norm just a century or two before, where the same guy would have been horrifically tortured and then killed. Due to his having to put down revolts across the north, the Duchy of Benevento in the south was able to remain semi-independent, grow its strength, and to take territory from the Eastern Empire. This would have effects in later history, but for now, the last revolts of the Arian nobility were being crushed, and upon King Kunigpert's death in 700, the land is firmly Catholic. As I noted before, children did not last long as king in the age. Luitprand, who was probably in his early teenage years, was Kunigpert's only son and rightful heir. He was put on the throne with the Duke of Asti, a man named Ansprand, as regent over him until King Luitprand reached manhood. Ansprand was a nobleman, fit as king in his own right, but he was not from the ruling Bavarian dynasty, which Pertrit before them had restored to power, bringing back the family of Theolinda before him. This was a dynasty which had regained power by this point, so Duke Ansprand, not being of the ruling dynasty, could not make a move. Not yet, at least. But there were other dukes who were of the Bavarian dynasty. The Duke of Turin, Ragenpert, was one such man, and seeing the king was in a weak position, gathered an army and marched upon Pavia. Ragenpert, along with his son Aripert, a different Aripert from earlier. These two and their army met the regent Ansprand in battle at Novara to the west of Milan, where the Duke of Turin defeated the regent. Young King Luitpert and his regent Ansprand were forced to flee over the Alps to Bavaria, where kinfolk of their dynasty held power. Ragenpert became king, but his glory was short. The reason of his death is unknown. We know that in the chaos, Luitpert came back over the mountains and took the kingship. Luitpert would have been quite young at this point. Ragenpert's son Aripert gathered a small army and threw Luitpert out, drowning the young man in a river. These were brutal times, and you could not have a rightful heir fleeing to your enemies, could you? But karma would come for Aripert with bittersweet irony. For the moment, however, King Aripert II became king in 701 and would reign for 11 years. The dukes of Spoleto and Benevento in the south revolted. He crushed these revolts, but it took his time and energy. In the north, he married a Frankish duke's daughter from Bavaria, Theodo, to secure his northern borders and to prevent more dynastic feuds coming from Bavaria. Despite this clever move, Ansprand, the tutor of the former young king, had escaped him. And despite his marriage to a Bavarian, Ansprand had friends there too. Yet, Ansprand took his time, gathering soldiers and money, maneuvering and waiting for the right time to strike his enemy. 11 years later, in the year 712, he rode south with a large army of Bavarian allies to the walls of Pavia, demanding he be crowned king. He forced Aripert to flee, who gathered up the treasury and rode off toward the Frankish kingdom. Crossing the river Ticino, he was weighed down by his gold, and he drowned. In a twist of fate, he died the same way he had killed young Luitpert. He drowned. As I noted, his end was an irony, The man who drowned a king was drowned fleeing from the tutor of that same king. History often rhymes, they say. Luitprand died after only 3 months on the throne in the year 712, and his son Luitprand became king. Luitprand was, by several historians, the greatest of the Lombard kings. Paul the Deacon's Historia Longobardum even ends with Luitprand's death, as if to say, "The rest is unworthy of me." Yet despite such praise, this king's boyhood did not suggest he would become great. Remember that his father had been driven out of Italy to Bohemia. King Arianism II even blinded and disfigured several members of his family, but he left the young prince alone because Luitprand looked so young and weak. He did not have the broad build and strength expected of an early medieval king. Clearly, King Arianism II did not consider the soul of the young man. Luitprand was courageous, as his career would show. Before he could even begin, one of his family tried to assassinate him. Luitprand found out about it and openly invited the would-be killer of his own kin to a banquet where he fought him to the death. He then had the man's 4 sons found and put to death. You could not leave loose ends, could you? According to Paul the Deacon, this happened again in the forest with 2 assassins, and Luitprand defeated them, and as they begged for their lives, he spared them. From the first year of his reign, he integrated new laws into the Edict of Rothari and reformed the Court of Justice, as well as the tradition of guild-regildo, or payments for injuries and bloodshed. With the rise of his father to power, the Bavarian dynasty, which had ruled off and on for over a century, had come to an end. Not all the dukes were happy with this, so he organized a legal assembly of the people to be held each year in Pavia, which was able to draft laws and give those of the fallen Bavarian dynasty a say in the direction of his kingdom. Luitprand strengthened the capital of Pavia, centralized the royal palace within the administration of the state, and created dozens of new administrative offices. This was to unify his lands and, he hoped, to prevent the discord that would lead to revolts. The last 30 years before him, in which Arians and Catholics fought each other, had seen too much infighting. There had to be peace within the realm. He sought a wife in his early reign named Guntrude, which helped him secure an alliance with Charles Martel, who held the office of Duke and Prince of the Franks, and went on to save our civilization by defeating a Muslim army at Toul in 732. For now, in 717, the Frankish kingdom to his north was in the midst of a civil war following the death of Pepin II. Unlike former Lombard kings, who did not meddle in foreign affairs, King Luitprand saw this as a chance to unify his people and gain political allies. This was a smart move, and since the Franks were squabbling after the death of Pepin, he could focus on the Byzantines in Italy. He faced an unruly duke in Spoleto, Ferwald II. This duke attacked the Byzantine port of Classe near Ravenna without Luitprand's consent. He was not ready for what was about to come, and at first he sought peace with the Eastern Empire, so he forced Ferwald II to give the port city back to the Byzantines. It was around this time that Arabs began raiding southern Italy, which meant he could expand without being defeated by the Byzantines, since they were tied up fighting the Mohammedans. He came together with his rebellious southern dukes and launched a 3-pronged attack upon Byzantine lands in Italy, and King Luitprand sacked Ravenna and took lands around it. However, Emperor Leo III in Constantinople had come to power in 717, ending nearly 20 years of anarchy. He defeated one of the biggest Muslim armies yet to attack our civilization, using Greek fire and Bulgarian allies to save Constantinople. He forced Jews to convert under pain of death. Then he brought in an iconoclasm. Iconoclasm means literally breaking of icons. So images of Mary, kings, and other things were smashed and people revering them attacked. Why am I talking about these political events further east? Because the Eastern Empire held Italian lands, rubbing up against both the Pope and the Lombard kingdom. Pope Gregory II ordered Catholics to resist Leo III's order to smash images. The tension during all this gave King Luitprand an opportunity to strike. He invaded Emilia, taking Bologna, Rimini, and Ancona, all within the Exarchate of Ravenna, which was oppressing Catholics. He found many supporters amongst the people. It was during all this, in what became an Italian revolt against the Byzantines, that Luitprand did something that still affects us today. The Pope was formally breaking with imperial authority and planting the roots of a new state with its own army around Rome. King Luitprand wanted to take the corridor of land, running between Rome and Ravenna along the ancient road of Via Flaminia, linking Rome with the Adriatic Sea, which split the lands of his Lombard kingdom in two. Pope Gregory II saw that if he did this, then the Lombards would then be able to capture Rome itself. And if you were building a state under the Pope, why would you let this happen? Now, no one, including the Pope, really understood the long-term effects of any of this, that it would split both Italy and Christianity, but the Pope could not allow himself to be ruled by an Eastern emperor who was smashing holy images. Neither could he let himself be ruled by the Lombards. In 728, Pope Gregory II pleaded to the Lombard king to grant him the lands around Sutri along this road. It just so happened that King Luitprand had quelled opposition to him in the south at this time, and he was in a good mood. The Lombards wanted to show they were good Catholics now, and across Western Europe, the barbarian kingdoms that were giving birth to what we understand as Western Europe today gave the Pope a kind of stabilizing moral authority that was sacred to kings. So if Luitprand gave the Pope these lands he asked for, after taking them from the Byzantines, would it not bless his kingdom below God? Luitprand agreed, and this became known as the Donation of Sutri, projecting papal power beyond Rome. This was the true beginning of the Papal States. Ironically, this would be the downfall of the Lombard kingdom half a century later, and it would ensure Italy remained split between north and south for another 1100 years. This small, seemingly meaningless act of kindness by Luitprand is what gave Italy its shape. There was peace for a while, in which Luitprand reformed his system of judges and tax systems. But Emperor Leo III would not just let his territories be lost, and the Eastern Empire attacked the south of Italy using its navy. Luitprand marched into the Byzantine stronghold of Ravenna in 737. Quite a prize. At this time, the southern duchies of Lombardy and Minor revolted against him, seeking independence through Byzantine aid, flipping sides. When he had nearly broken the empire's power in Italy, this was a sudden turnaround. The Exarch of Ravenna, Eutychius, sailed to Naples, where he met with Luitprand to discuss the future of Italy. The empire would help him defeat the southern revolts if he marched against the Pope, who he had given lands to. He had no real choice. He could not risk losing his southern duchies, nor could he risk falling into a long-term war with Leo III's renewed empire of religious fanatics. King Luitprand and the Byzantine Exarch marched on Rome. The Pope came to meet them and the three sides held council. They came to agreements of peace, but this does not mean that the peace lasted long. The main issue was the decentralized system of dukes within the Lombard kingdom. The Dukes of Friuli in the northwest and Spoleto in the south revolted in the late 730s. In response to this, King Luitprand killed a few people. After getting rid of the Duke of Friuli, Luitprand gave his loyal nephew, Ratchis, the dukedom. Keep in mind, the Duke of Friuli was a powerful rank to have in this kingdom, and Ratchis would come back. Even so, there were further revolts in the south, well into the 740s. He had to contend with the Byzantine Spoleto alliances and wage another war against the empire, which he won, by the way. In 741, a new pope, Zachary, met with Luitprand, and they agreed to peace under the terms that were actually more favorable to the pope than to Luitprand. He was not able to keep hold of Ravenna, which is crazy to me, as Luitprand was in a position where he could have wiped out the fledgling papal states if he wanted to. He did not want to, though. It seems in his later reign he grew tired of fighting all these wars and focused on legal power as well as religious stability within his kingdom. On a cultural note, the Germanic Lombardic language is clearly still spoken at this point in the early mid-700s, giving words today in Italian, like the words for blood feud, faida, and the word for knuckle, and even the word for bank we use in English. But Luitprand's laws show us that Lombards and Romans were mixing more and more, and that the Lombard language has begun to decline by this point, in the early mid-8th century. One flaw in his long and remarkable reign is his wife Gertrude did not give him any male children. He was angry about this, but as a testimony to his talents and skills, King Luitprand had an idea. He developed his nephew Rochus, the Duke of Friuli, as his heir. However, back in the 730s at the Siege of Ravenna, Luitprand had fallen ill and nearly died. His nobles held a vote and declared Hildeprand his successor. From this point, Hildeprand was co-ruler to an extent, but Luitprand was clearly in charge still. Luitprand overcame his illness, but now he could not go against the majority of his men. Hildeprand was now heir to his throne, though King Luitprand still gave Rochus the Dukedom of Friuli, a tough and wealthy border zone which required grit to stay in power. This was clearly meant to prepare young Rochus for a future role as king. Luitprand died in 744 after a reign of 32 years. And from this point, we must go with other historical sources than Paul the Deacon's Historia. If your name becomes Hildeprand the Useless, it might suggest you were not a good king. Luitprand clearly wanted another nephew, Rochus, the Duke of Friuli, to be king. It did not go that way. Hildeprand had acted as a sort of under-king below Luitprand since 735. He had every legal right to be king. And yet, after King Luitprand died, Hildeprand found he could not fill such a great man's shoes. Only 3 months into Hildeprand's rule, when he chose a policy of appeasing the Pope, the supporters of Rochus overthrew him and declared Rochus king in 744. If you were Rochus, already holding the wealthy dukedom of Friuli, would you accept? It would mean you were a popular king, but it would bind you to a political trap in which you could not compromise with the Pope, due to the faction who had supported you, possibly leading to the ruin of your lands. Curiously, one of the first things Rochus did was to add an additional clause into the Edict of Rethari to strengthen the borders of the kingdom. Given that papal lands divided his kingdom in two, this would have been an attempt to isolate the Pope politically and economically. We can think of it today as a kind of economic blockade of the Papal States. He foresaw the Pope linking up with the Franks to their north and using a network of spies in the church. King Rochus also comes across as a bit paranoid because he passes policies aimed against his own nobility. He gave the Gassendi, the minor nobility, legal right to challenge the dukes. Given he took the throne and had no legal right to rule in the eyes of many, he may have been trying to prevent revolts against his rule from the upper class by building a base in the class of men just below them. But he is too heavy-handed and went about this the wrong way. Then again, it was the hardliners, the extreme anti-pope faction, who had put him into power. And then, trying to win over locals against his own faction potentially, he chose the Roman title princeps, abandoning the title king of the Lombards. His dukes were not impressed. As this did not work, King Ratchis turned to war. He attacked the Byzantine Duchy of Perugia, which in itself would have worked to link up the north and south. But then he listened to the Pope, who asked him to lift the siege, which angered his own supporters. It looks to me like he had the right war strategy, but that when it came to people, he did not have social skills. I don't know, but that's what it looks like to me. Like a good military commander, but unable to talk to people? If this was the case, a king who was not an effective communicator could not rule for long. At an assembly in Milan, opponents chose his brother Aistulf, the Duke of Friuli, to make his case to be king. For whatever reason, King Ratchis did not make an effective case to oppose his own removal. He took his family south to an abbey at Monte Cassino, a nice place to retire, but he would be back. Aistulf became king at Milan in 747. He proved much more ruthless and effective. His first move was to reorganize the Lombard army, strengthen mountain border passes, expand the military draft to all free men, and ramp up the making of chainmail, shields, and weapons. He knew the Lombard kingdom could not last in an Italy split between Lombard dukes, papal lands, and the Eastern Empire. King Aistulf sought to unify it under his crown. I should note that King Aistulf had hated King Luitprand, due to his disputes with his father Pemo in Friuli, and in my opinion he had daddy issues and wanted to get one better on King Luitprand by doing even better than him. You have to remember, these guys were people with flaws, ambitions, jealousies, and problems just like us. Even if they did live in a time of less nonsense, where virtue and honor actually meant something for most men. Personally, I hope virtue and honor means something again within my lifetime. Keep fighting for meaning in your lives, guys. After King Aistulf had spent a couple years establishing his rule, he gathered an army and marched on the exarchate of Ravenna and took over all of its territory. In truth, King Aistulf had had a bit of luck. The empire under its new emperor Constantine V had launched an invasion in the east to liberate lands taken by Muslims, which included wiping out the fleet of the Caliphate. This meant the empire could not afford reinforcements, whilst pushing the frontiers of our civilization back eastward. In Ravenna, this imperial stronghold had long been the most stubborn thorn in the side of the Lombard kingdom, and so when Aistulf captured it, he went a step further than Luitprand had ever thought of. King Aistulf briefly held his court and government in the former exarch's palace at Ravenna. He annexed the exarchate directly into the Lombard kingdom, and instead of creating a new duchy within his kingdom, Ravenna would belong to the king, him. He also took the papal lands to the north of Sutria. He then claimed the title King of the Romans. This was a bold statement which alarmed the Pope in Rome. In the same southeastward thrust, King Aistulf attacked the Duchy of Spoleto, where the Duke had just died. He took over the duchy and imposed direct rule, claiming the title for himself. This meant he had the Pope surrounded on three sides, with no way for the new Pope, Stephen II, to link up with the Byzantine soldiers by land. Pope Stephen II had come to power in 752, and saw King Aistulf's move for what it was, a threat to his own independence. But for now, he could do nothing as the Lombard king forced him to pay a heavy annual tribute. This was shameful, and the Pope said so in letters to other lands, calling it an affront to God. It also left the Pope with no choice but to make offers to the mighty kingdom of the Franks far to the north. Though the Frankish kingdom was divided, each of its pieces were strong in their own right. Pepin the Short now ruled over the west, which would eventually become France. The Pope, sensing how urgent the position was, traveled in the middle of winter over the Alps to meet with King Pepin and sway him to send an army. Despite the mayor of the palace warning him not to, King Pepin agreed and marched with him back over the Alps at the head of an army in the early summer of 754. But he waited at the border and did not invade yet. You might say, wait a minute, he went in winter but the war did not take place until summer? What's going on? This was a time in which the rhythm was slower, more human. The Pope traveling in winter was a crazy thing to do, and decisions of war and peace often took months of counsel. Sometimes, people just waited for a few months to see if things changed before invading someone. Festivals were held in line with the seasons. Days and nights had deeper meanings. Guests who arrived in winter seldom left before Passover or Easter. The Pope promised Pepin the title, Patrician of the Romans, and the king agreed. Do you notice something here, how titles are being used? This was not new, but what was new is that the Pope gave a foreign king an Italian title. This would keep happening. The Pope had found a way to fight a war against the Lombards through diplomacy. King Pepin sent an envoy that he give up rule over the Papal States' land around Sutria that Luitprand had given the Pope years before by treaty. King Aistulf said no, so King Pepin invaded Italy in early 755 after gathering more troops. Remember what I said about things moving at a slower rhythm? It had taken over a year for the war to even start. King Pepin quickly forced King Aistulf to take up a defensive position at Pavia, where he held out against a siege for months. To lift the siege, King Aistulf agreed to a peace treaty that was favorable to the Franks, including giving back all the lands taken from the Pope and a small annual tribute. But the Pope had called King Aistulf what he was, shameless. As soon as the Frankish king crossed back over the Alps, King Aistulf broke the peace treaty and attacked the Pope. You think he would have learned? I mean, he was king and had a strong kingdom. He did not need to throw it all away. I guess he did not think the Franks would come back. He launched an attack on Rome, and so the Pope wrote letters to King Pepin begging him to come back, which he did. The Pope wrote, I urge and exhort you to protect my flock, defend Rome and your brother the Romans from the heinous Lombards. Come, come, in the name of the one living and true God. This is getting repetitive, and this happens a few times with the Franks and Lombards here, but it is important for what happened next. King Aistulf died, and despite this, the Franks did not conquer the Lombard lands. They left it a patchwork of uncontrollable dukes, who kept launching raids into the Alps and into the Papal States. This could not go on, could it? Before King Aistulf's death, he had passed one law which I find amusing. Apparently it was a custom to throw dirty water on a wedding party to show displeasure if you didn't agree with the marriage, and apparently people did this. So King Aistulf rightly banned this filthy practice, and though he was a diplomatic idiot that nearly destroyed his kingdom, he was a skilled commander in military matters, and I approve of this law. When he died in early 756, the former King Ratchis came back from his monastery and tried to become king at Pavia. But the nobles just said no, and they backed the Duke of Tuscany, Desiderius, who stormed the palace and took the crown for himself. King Desiderius had been in contact with the Pope for a while, and used his support to gain a small army and take power, promising him several lost papal towns in return. This is epic soap drama stuff, and yes, the name Desiderius in Latin means desire in English. Early on, King Desiderius sought to bring the south under his direct rule. He married off his daughter, Adalpurga, to Arianism II, Duke of Benevento, to secure loyalty. Adalpurga would later have Paul the Deacon write the history of the Lombard kingdom. But for now, as was by this point a pattern for Lombard kings, Desiderius invaded Spoleto, removed the duke, and claimed the land for himself. You can see by this point that the Lombards' main problem is this ducal structure of government that prevented them from forming a coherent state. Like his predecessor, he was forced by King Pepin to return papal lands. And they kept attacking the Pope, which seems like you're begging for the Franks to come back. Anyway, at this time the Pope died, and King Desiderius did something either very bold or very dumb. I cannot decide which. He rode to Rome and captured a random Roman priest named Philip, and appointed Philip as Pope. The king had no ecclesiastical authority, and no one accepted this. The new Pope, Stephen III, fell out with King Desiderius, as you would expect, which was very bad for the Lombards. King Desiderius was losing his face internationally, but he still had one really good card to play. He married off his daughter, Desiderata, to Pepin the Short's son, King Charlemagne of the Franks. This would have seemed a wise thing to do, and it would have worked if Desiderius had not been so rude to the Pope, who did not approve of the marriage, as it joined that most notable race of the Franks and the fetid brood of the Lombards that had brought leprosy into the land. For anyone wondering why leprosy is used here, it is a reference to the Bible in which the anger of God brings about leprosy. The Pope doesn't like the Lombards. According to the life of St. Gall, written over half a century later, Charlemagne cast Desiderata aside because she was not likely to provide Charlemagne with children. Or in other words, he found a legal way out of his marriage to avoid international scandal. Shortly after his daughter returned to Pavia in disgrace, a new pope was chosen in Rome, Adrian I. Desiderius launched an attack upon the new pope before he could consolidate power. I guess that part made a little sense, but this was foolish, on account of Pope Hadrian I being friends with Charlemagne, who now ruled over a vast, united, and powerful Frankish kingdom. For about the 5th or 6th time, a pope appealed to the Franks to intervene and stop the Lombards. Charlemagne's own father, Pepin, had settled a peace treaty with the Lombards, giving back lands. King Charlemagne even tried to negotiate peace, with all three parties meeting at Moselle, but King Desiderius would not agree to giving up any right to the Papal State's land. Charlemagne was not like those who came before. He did not have time for this bickering and petty nonsense. In 773, he invaded Italy with 2 armies. There are many stories of conquest that followed, legends that have grown over time into silly fantasy and quite good stories, actually. But to be brief, Desiderius fell back to Pavia and defended against an 8-month-long siege, after which Charlemagne captured the king. However, Desiderius had succeeded in sending his son Adalgis away to the Byzantines, who came back over a decade later with an army to try and reclaim the kingdom, but Adalgis was defeated. Oh well. As Indro Montanelli and Roberto Gervaso noted in their epic work, Storia d'Italia, the Lombards had been awkward masters, and for the Romans under them it is hard to say whether or not this Frankish conquest was good or bad. What is certain is that the Lombard kingdom in its death gave birth to something much bigger, the Holy Roman Empire. This would form over the next century out of this. Charlemagne received the title of Western Emperor from Pope Leo III, who used it as a weapon of propaganda against the Eastern Empire. Charlemagne left the local Lombards to practice their laws and customs, but took the title King of the Lombards, attaching this to his title King of the Franks, making him the first of the post-Roman rulers to do such a thing. The story of the Holy Roman Empire that followed is clearly beyond the scope of this video, but the fall of the Lombards is what allowed it to happen. It's what allowed the West to stabilize and secure itself again for the first time in centuries. As for the Lombards, the story is not yet over. The rebellious duchies of the south held on as vassals to Charlemagne, but in truth, they used their position between Frankish and Byzantine control to keep their independence. Out of this, the Principality of Benevento rose in power, which shaped the south of Italy for the next 300 years, and that story is the next chapter. If you would like to support the channel, buy me a coffee. Thank you very much for watching. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wylio.